So again, I think it's a little bashert that exactly at the time that we're looking at these particular Yud Gimel Middos, all of the examples are drawn from Saras, which happens to be the parsha that we're coming up to. So, Baruch Hashem, it's a chance for you to learn a little bit more about Saras that perhaps you were not familiar with. And again, it's a very, very technical subject. There's a whole Maseches of the Mishnah, very big Maseches, 13 very hard prakim, Maseches Negoyim, that is about the different laws of Saras. There's Saras of the flesh in different varieties, and there's also Saras on garments and Saras on houses. And the halachas are very, very intricate. In fact, the Chazal themselves use the laws of Saras as an example of things that are very complex. At one point, Rabbi Akiva wanted to darshan Agadata. So whatever it is, some of the Tanoim Rabbi Akiva's Chaverim didn't like his Agada. So they basically said, Akiva, you should stick to Negoyim and Oalos. Negoyim is about Saras, and Oalos is Tumas Meis, also a very, very hard. In other words, your expertise are complex halachic matters, and therefore stay out of Agada. I mean, that's what they said. I mean, we don't, Rabbi Akiva is good in Agada also, but they were basically saying stick to Negoyim and Oalos. Okay. So, Baruch Hashem, so I'm kind of happy that it works out this way, that you get some idea in Saras precisely when we're going to read about it. Yeah.
Why do they say that if we don't, isn't there a cloud, like, if it's Rabbi Akiva versus like Chaver, maybe
in halacha, that's exactly the point. Halacha Rabbi Akiva mechavera. So, among Gedolei Yisrael, again, I'm not talking about the Tanoim, that we can't talk about, but among Gedolei Yisrael, there are some Gedolim who are, Gedolim specialize also. Gadol is familiar with everything. But there are Gedolim who have a specialty in Hilchos Shabbos. There are Gedolim that have a specialty in Mikveh, in Erevin. So people do develop specialties. There are Gedolim who are also Balei Machshava. They have very deep philosophical ideas. And there are Gedolim who are not necessarily involved in what we call machshava or hashkafa, right? So the notion of a specialty is not inconsistent with a person's gadlus in Torah. And those Tanoim were saying, again, we can't say such a thing, that they felt Rabbi Akiva was greater in halacha than Agada. It's interesting to take an example much, much later. The Vilna Gaon said about the Shagas Aryeh. He said that in Nigle, meaning the revealed part of the Torah, Shas and Poskim, it's he and I. So the Vilna Gaon considered the Shagas Aryeh greater than him in Nigle. In Nistar, in Kabbalah, it's I and he, meaning the Vilna Gaon considered himself a little greater in Kabbalah than the Shagas Aryeh, although you can see that the Shagas Aryeh was considered to be either number one or number two in the eyes of the Vilna Gaon. So if you ever have occasion to learn the Shagas Aryeh, be aware of how great the Shagas Aryeh was, even in the eyes of the Vilna Gaon. Okay, so again, and I know I'm repeating and reviewing things, but I think the nature of the material is such that reiteration and chazara is kedai. To understand all the examples, again, there are three categories of saras you got to keep in mind as the Torah sets them up. There is saras or basar, which is saras of the flesh. There is saras shechin umichva, which is also saras of the flesh, but it comes after a bruise that had a scab on it. That's called shechin, a boil, or a michveh, or it comes after a burn. So it's the same thing. It's the same white nega, but it comes after a bruising of the body or a burning of the body. Shechin is a bruise, a scab that comes as a result of a bruise, a wound. And michva, not to be confused with michya, that's another word. Michva is saras that comes from a burn. So they're identical. We'll see halachically, we just talk about shechin and michva as a category. And the third category we're going to talk about is nesakin, and that is also a nega that appears in a place of hair, like the top of the head or the beard. Okay, so three different parshios in the Torah: saras or basar, Shechin Michveh, which are also, although there are two, but they're treated the same, and Nisakim, singular is Nesek. Now, for Saras or Basar, you have 2 weeks of quarantine, up to 2 weeks of quarantine, and 3 simanim of tuma. Again, I hope you got what I mean by that. In other words, the 3 simanim of tuma are the black hairs turning white. That's sar lavan, michya, healthy flesh, or pisayon, expansion. Okay, 2 weeks of quarantine, 3 simanim of tuma. If one of those simanim do not appear by the end of week 2, the person is tahar. That is, so if one of them does appear, he then has to go through the whole ritual of bringing korbanos and the like. Okay. Now, for shechin and michveh, the Torah picks up some of the details, but not all of them. It mentions sar lavan, it mentions pisayon, it does not mention michya. Don't confuse that with michva. Michva is burn, michya is healthy flesh. So it omits 2 things. It omits michya as a simin tuma, and it omits a 2nd week of quarantine. It only talks about 1 week of quarantine, and it talks about sar lavan or pisayon. It omits michya. Right, that is shechin and michveh. Shechin and michveh omits 2nd week of quarantine and omits michya as a siman of tuma. So the question becomes, can I add another week of quarantine and another sign of tuma based on the fact that shechin and michveh is also in the klal of saras or basar? So shechin and michveh is illustrative of klal number 9. So again, klal tes, midah tes. Let's find it here. Number 9. Kol davar shahaya bichlal. Anything that was within the generalization, i.e. shechin u'michveh, would have been within or basar. Had the Torah not singled it out, I would have analyzed shechin and michveh like or basar. Who cares if there was a bruise or a burn? V'yatsa litain tayanechachu kinyano. And it is separated out, picking up some of ke'inyano, some of the details ke'inyano that are the same as the klal that it came from. It picked up 1 week of quarantine, it picked up sar lavan, and it picked up pisayon, but it didn't pick up everything. Right? This is omission. So in such a situation, Yatsa lahakel v'lo lahachmir. Its separation means it will be lenient with respect to the details that were not picked up. In other words, what was picked up was picked up. What was not picked up was not picked up. Therefore, what does this mean practically? That shechin and michveh do not have a 2nd week of quarantine. And shechin and michveh do not have the simin tuma of michya. In other words, the partial picking up of the klal creates a leniency with respect to the halachos that were not picked up. All right, the Rishonim asked the kasha, why do you have to say yatsa lahakel v'lo lahachmir? I mean, if you're going to be mekel, you're not going to be machmir. Okay. We don't have to get into diyukim because the main point is to understand the midah. So therefore, this midah tells me, what does this midah tell me? That when something would have been in a general category, but it gets separated out to pick up some of the details, which are the same. That's ki'in yano. It picks up things that are the same. But it omits other details. Its separation from the klal will be a kula and not a chumrah, which is another way of saying whatever it says, it says. Whatever it doesn't say, it doesn't say. So there's a kula here. The kula is that by shechin and michveh, if you don't have a siman tuma by the end of week number 1, you're tor. Unlike or basar, where you would have to have another week of quarantine. Okay? And similarly, if at the end of week number 1, the nega did not grow, but there is healthy flesh in the middle, we're mekel. You're tor, rather than being machmir, that is a siman of tuma. Yatsa lahakel v'lo lahachmir. Now, toein echad shehu kinyano means it picks up things that are the same, kinyano. They are the same as are in the klal, but it only picks them up partially. Okay, so yatsa lahakel v'lo lahachmir. Okay, so practically, this is how we know. This is the midah that tells me that shechin and michveh only have 1 week of quarantine, and shechin and michveh only have 2 signs of tuma rather than 3, pisayon, expansion, and sar lavan, and they don't have michveh. Now, what's interesting is, in some ways, I mean, this is complicated and it's stated complicated, but in a sense, this is actually a very commonsensical midah, and you probably would have come to this conclusion intuitively. And as I'm reading the parsha of Saras or Basar, and then I'm reading the parsha of Shechin and Michveh. Shechin and Michveh only mention Sar Lavan and Pisayon, and Shechin and Michveh only mention 1 week. So intuitively, I think many of us would have said, oh, assuming you're able to get through this technical stuff, that must mean, for whatever reason, and obviously there are reasons for this we don't really understand. I'm not getting into the reasons right now. But for whatever the reason, the Torah doesn't give you a 2nd week for Shechin and Michvah, and the Torah doesn't give you a sign of Mechia. You're simply looking, right? So in some ways, as complicated as this formulation is, it is a very natural way of how we would read the juxtaposition of those parshios. Right? So, just like the person who did not know he was speaking prose all of his life. Okay, thought prose was like a fancy thing, Prose is just speaking. He says, you didn't know that you were applying this midah all the time. When you read Chumash, you were actually applying this midah as part of the normal way you read things. Right? So, as complicated as the verbal formulations are, they're actually expressing a fairly, I mean, not everything, Gzeres Shavos or, Gzeres HaKosovs, but this type of literary analysis is actually a very natural way of reading it. I mean, this is how I think you would read on your own, even without knowing this midah. This is how you would read the comparison between or basar and shechin and michveh. Okay? So again, midah number 9 is when the yotzei min haklal picks up some of the details, but not all of them. So the answer is whatever it doesn't pick up doesn't apply, making the separated item more makel than the item from which it came. Okay? So that is midah number 9. So therefore, midah number 9 is comparing or basar with shechin and michveh, which are treated as one category. Now, let's look at nisakim. Nisakim is a 3rd category of saras, and that too would have fallen under or basar. Right? The fact that it's on my head or my beard, it's still on my skin. Yep. But the Torah separated out, and it gave certain rules that are different than or basar. Number 1, there is a 2-week quarantine. Okay, so shechinu michveh is 1 week, but nisakim do have a 2-week quarantine. But the simanei tuma that are mentioned are pisayon, expansion, or a new thing, sar tzahov. Tzahov is yellow, blonde. and when it says sar, it means two hairs. That if two hairs turn blonde, they have to turn blonde. If they were blonde, that wouldn't count, but they went from their natural color to a blondish yellow. And by the way, Saras has all sorts of details, like how yellow is yellow. In other words, we just say yellow, but there are halachos regarding how yellow, what shade of yellow. Okay, we don't have to get into all of that. But if you had to paskin on Saras, there would be a lot of details, specific knowledge you'd have to have. So the Torah says by Nisakim that the two simanim that are mentioned are pisayon, expansion, or sar tzahuf. It doesn't mention michya, clean flesh, and it does not mention sar lavan. But it doesn't negate them either. It doesn't negate them, it just doesn't mention them. So the question once again becomes, to what degree can I borrow from or basar and apply michya and sar lavan? So this is picked up with Midah number 9. Midah number 10. Let's plug it into the words. Kol davar shahaya bichlal. Nisakim would have been within the category of or basar. V'yatsa litain tayen acher shalo ki'inyano. But it was singled out for a detail that does not correspond to the subject of the original klal. Nisakim was singled out. But unlike the singling out of Shechin Mikveh, where every single thing mentioned in Shechin and Mikveh corresponds to the klal, but it's incomplete, Nisakim has something new that is added to what was in the klal, namely, sar tzahov is a siman tumah. So here, the difference is yatsa lahakel ulahachmir. Here, you will have both a chumrah and a kula. You will still have the kula, that what was not stated will not apply, so you're not going to have a siman tumah of white hair, or a siman tumah of michya, that's the kula. The chumrah, which is obvious in a sense, will be the addition of the sar tzahov. So the only difference between 9 and 10 is that in 9, nothing new was added. So all you can do is negate what you would have taken from the klal. And that's called being mekel. In 10, in addition to negating what you would take from the klal, which is your kula, you happen to have a chumrah, which is the new thing that is stated. Okay? Now, once again, this is actually, pretty intuitive. Meaning to say, if I would be reading the Parsha of Nisakim, I would see there are 2 weeks of quarantine. I would see there is a siman tumah of 2 yellow hairs. And I see there's a siman tumah of pisayon. I see there's no mention of the siman tumah of 2 white hairs. And there's no mention of the siman tumah of michya. So I think almost on my own, I would generally, again, I know these are Gzeres HaKosovs, I can't give you reasons for it, but Me'ezes Ham She'iyah, the Torah is telling me that 2 simanim of Tumah don't apply by Nisakim. So now you have the label. It was Yatsa Liton Toan Echad Shelo Ki'inyano, that's Yatsa Lahakel Ulahachmir. Lahakel on what it doesn't say, Lahachmir with respect to the new thing that is mentioned. But 9 and 10 are both telling me I can no longer connect it to the klal, even though Shechin and Mikveh would have been within the klal, because it's or basar, it's on your skin. And even though Nisakim would have been in the klal, because even if it's on your beard, but it's not on the hair of your beard, it's on the skin, so it would have been in the klal. But because the Torah separated out for distinct treatment, it is excluded from the klal. Sometimes that will be just to be mekel, and sometimes it'll be mekel and machmir, depending on whether the thing that's mentioned separately has some new chumrah. In the case of Shchin and Mikveh, there is no new Chumrah. It only picks up some of the things that are in the klal, so that's Yatsa Lahakel V'lo Lahachmir. And in the case of Nesakim, it's Yatsa Lahakel Ulahachmir. Machmir, that Sar Tzahuv is a Siman Tumah, which it is not for Saras or Basar, right? If you had a yellow hair and a regular Negat Saras, it would not make you Tameh, right? So that's Yatsa Lahachmir. And Yatsa Lahakel is you don't have Michya and you don't have Sar Lavan. Okay? So you see the connection between 9 and 10. So 9 is when the Yaitse Min HaKlal picks up part, but not all. 10 is also, it picks up part and not all, but it also adds something new. It adds something new. That's the difference, okay? So you look at this, you plug in the example, and it makes a lot of sense. And as I say, these two Middos are actually logical and intuitive, and that's the way you would normally read things. And in fact, as I say, you have probably, as you learned Chumash, you have probably done this naturally. Maybe not in Saras, but you've done this naturally. I still remember just about Saras. I go back to when I was in 9th grade. So I think it was literally the first time I ever had to learn Parshas Tazria. I had not learned it in day school or whatever. So we used to get Chumash tests, I think Friday morning. And I didn't know somehow there would be a test, so I still remember the abject terror of what's it like. I found out like Thursday night, like 10 o'clock, we were going to get a test the next day on Parshas Tazria. I still remember that I had absolutely no idea of what was going on. It didn't make English, Hebrew, it didn't make a difference whatever you had. I think what happened was they canceled the test because I wasn't the only one that had that terror. But I still remember that, it's a very, very hard, I mean, even for an adult, for whatever it is, it's a very, very hard parsha. And it's worthwhile to look at, okay? So you see the difference between 9 and 10. 9 is when it picks up some of the klal, not all of it, but adds nothing new. 10 is also when it picks up part of the klal and not all of it, but it adds something new. Now, when it adds something new, that is called toan echad, a burden, shalo ki inyano, that is not in the inyan of the klal. When it doesn't pick up anything new, that's called shahu ki inyano. Everything it picks up is in the klal. So you understand the lashon. Shahu ki inyano, shalo ki inyano. Okay. And then, now going, so one second. So klal 9 is partial omission. Klal 10 is partial omission with augmentation. Okay? And then klal 11, which we looked at, is when there's actual contradiction mamish, meaning it doesn't just add something. Adding is not called a contradiction. Adding is just adding, right? But contradiction is when it literally says something that is the opposite of what the klal said. And here, again, if you'll remember the example, this is the din of asham mitzora, that when a mitzora brings a korban asham, after the blood is applied to the mizbeach, there is matan dam on his earlobe, on his thumb, and on his toe. Now that contradicts the normal din of asham, because the normal din of asham is, the Torah says specifically, all blood left over after you apply to the altar should be poured on the foundation. So this is not just adding a detail. You see, this is very important. You could have said, bahonos is adding a detail. If that would be the case, it would have fallen under 10. Toan achar shalo ki inyano. But it doesn't fall under 10, although the rule is going to be the same, so it makes no difference really, but it does not fall under 10, it falls under 11. This is called davar hachadash, meaning, definitionally, the difference between toan acher shalo ki inyano and davar hachadash is toan acher shalo ki inyano is the addition of a detail that you didn't have in the klal, such as sar tzahov. But davar chadash is a contradiction to what the klal said. that you put the blood in the bahonos instead of pouring it on the basis of the mizbeach. Now, these are subtle distinctions, but the bottom line is the rule is the same. Whether there's a contradiction or whether there's an additional detail, you don't allow the klal to go back unless the Torah specifically brought it back. And you'll recall, that's why the Torah had to teach me that I shecht the Asham Mitzera on the north of the Mizbeach, because I wouldn't have derived it from the general rule of Asham because of Davar HaChadash. The Rishonim actually ask, to be frank, the Rishonim do ask the kasha, why does Rabbi Yishmael have to subdivide 11 and 12? 10 and 11. 10 is a new detail that's not a contradiction, like Sar Tzahov. 11 talks about a new detail that is a contradiction. So one is called Toan Achar Shalo Kinyano, and one is called Davar Chadash. But the rule is exactly the same. The rule is you don't take from the klal unless the Torah specifically allows you to incorporate it. So analytically, there's no particular reason to subdivide. You could even use the word Davar Chadash for both. I could call a new detail as a Davar Chadash. That would be the natural reading of it. So we'll leave it with the kasha. The truth is, there is not a great teretz for this. The Rishonim actually say, technically it was superfluous. He just wanted to sensitize us to different nuances of how things can be expressed. But you understand how 10 and 11 are essentially the same rule. Okay? That you can't bring it back to the klal unless the Torah brings it back for you. Okay, so 9, 10, 11. 9 is when you have a partial pickup of the klal but nothing new is added. 10 is something new is added, but it's not a direct contradiction. And 11 is something new is added, that is a direct contradiction. In all three of these rules, you cannot apply the halachas of the klal to the prat unless the Torah specifically authorizes it. Now, I will ask another kasha. The unless clause, l'chayre, should go back on all three rules, 9, 10, 11. In other words, because obviously if the Torah itself allows you to borrow from the klal, you will borrow from the klal. So why is it only stated in number 11? It should have been stated at the end of 9 and 10 as well. It could be that maybe the way you read it is the ad shiach sirena is going back on all three of those middos. That 9, 10, 11, you cannot bring it back to the klal unless the Torah specifically brought it back to you. Okay? Everyone understands the relationship of these middos. And as I say, as complicated as the language is, they are actually stating a relatively intuitive way that we would read the text. Right? 9, 10, 11, yeah.
What would be an example of the Torah bringing it back to the klal?
Okay, so actually the only example, once again, is Mitzvah, and that is the following, that the Torah has to tell me that an asham of Mitzvah is slaughtered on the north side of the Mizbeach. So the question is, why does the Torah have to tell me that the asham of a Mitzvah is shechted on the north side of the Mizbeach? The Torah says in Parshas Tzav that all ashamos are slaughtered on the north side of the Mizbeach. The answer is because since Asham Mitzvah was singled out from the klal for the Davar HaChadash of Bahonos, I would not have been able to connect it to the klal that you have to shecht on the north, but by the Torah telling me I shechted on the north, the Torah is telling you can bring it back to the klal for that halacha. That's an example of Yachzirenu HaKosov Lichlalo Beferish. The Torah is bringing it back to the klal in spite of the fact that it does have a Davar HaChadash. Okay? So maybe that's why it's here, because it's only in that case of Davar HaChadash that we have an example of bringing it back. But in theory, in any of these three rules, if the Torah tells you to bring it back to the klal, you would do so. Okay? So this is 9, 10, 11. 8 is the only one where we move in the opposite direction. And instead of separating it from the klal, we bring it back to the klal. And when does that happen? When it's yotza min haklal lelamed, when it's taken from the klal to teach me something. Well, that's not a very helpful description. I mean, everything is taken from the klal to teach you something. So here, as I indicated, and again, forgive me for repeating, this refers to where the yotze min haklal either repeats, in other words, it doesn't omit, it doesn't add, it doesn't contradict. It either repeats or it clarifies an ambiguity. In other words, what doesn't it do? We're not talking about adding a new thing, we're not talking about contradicting, and we're not talking about omitting. We are talking about a repeat, a pure repeat, or clarification of an ambiguity. I'll give you an example right away. In that situation, the repeat or the clarification of the ambiguity is not only referring to this, but it goes back on the whole klal. I gave you, again, forgive the review, I gave you 3 examples of Midah number 8. The first is the Torah says don't do malacha on Shabbos. That's a klal. 39 malachas. It then says, don't burn fire on Shabbos. That was in the klal of malacha. It's repeating. All it's doing is repeating the general rule onto a specific detail. Right? It's not adding. It's not deleting. It's not contradicting. It's just repeating. So, it got to come for some reason. And the answer is, it is coming for a reason, which we'll see what it is. And the reason that it's coming for is not only for itself, but it goes back on the whole klal. And you'll remember, by way of review, that this teaches me the very important principle of lechalek. Lechalek would be, let's assume I'm a chalal Shabbos b'shogeg, and I do several malachos. Do I bring one sin offering? Or do I one chatas? Or do I bring a chatas for every malacha? If I just would have had one klal, don't do work on Shabbos, then if I cook and I write and I harvest, I would only bring one chatas. But by mentioning fire separately, it's a new prohibition for which I'm chayav a separate chatas. So if I cook and I have fire, I'm going to be chayav too. So that teaches me that it's not only fire that gets a separate treatment, but it goes back on the klal. Every malacha gets separate treatment. Lo lelamed al atzmo yatsa. It is not only coming to teach me about fire, but lelamed al haklal kulo yatsa. It's coming to teach me about the whole klal, that every single malacha of Shabbos will carry a separate korban chatas, even if fire was not involved. If I wrote and I sewed and I carried, there was no fire, I'm chayav 3 chatais, because the chiddush of havara, that you're chayav a separate chatas, goes back on all the malachas. Now, why don't I apply the other rules? Because the other rules apply when you have a detail that's either incomplete or contradictory or additional. This is not none of those. This is just repeating a din. Thou shalt not do malacha, thou shalt not have a fire. I knew that already. There is nothing new that's being added at all. So this is where I apply number 8, is lamed al klal. Now, in this particular example, however, the chiddush is both a chiddush for fire and a chiddush for everything else. Because without the mention of fire, I would have thought even for fire you're not chayav a separate chatas. So this is an example where it's teaching me both on itself and on the klal. The other 2 examples, okay. Example number 2. Okay, you'll see what I mean. Example number 2. Again, this is way of chazara. Forgive me. Is sorcery. The Torah says, "Machashefa lo sechaya." He or she who practices magic, sorcery is chayav misa. It doesn't say what the death penalty is. There are 4 types of death penalties. What do you get? Doesn't say. It says, however, by 2 specific types of sorcery, ohr.edu. These are various sorceries that bring up the dead. You're chayav skila. Now here, this is not quite the same as the Shabbos example. In the case of the Shabbos example, that was a pure repetition. The Torah says, don't do malacha, don't burn fire. That's a repetition. This is not exactly a repetition, because in the general category of don't be a sorcerer, or it says chayav misa, this tells me a new bit of information, that the misa that you get is stoning. So it's not exactly the same, but it's not a contradiction, and it's not even called an addition. It's a clarification of an ambiguity. Because when the Torah says you get the death penalty, I don't know what that is. So in this case, I don't apply 9, 10, and 11. I simply say this is doing is clarifying an ambiguity, and the ambiguity that it's clarifying is going back on the klal. So every type of kishuf, even not ohr.edu, is going to get skila. Now here too, let me point out that this is like Shabbos in the following way. This is teaching me a chiddush, not only for the klal, it's also a chiddush for ohr.edu. Because had I not had this statement that ohr.edu is chayav skila, I wouldn't have known ohr.edu either, right? So the chiddush is on the thing itself, but it goes back on the klal. Now, the third example is where there's no chiddush in the prat at all, and it's only coming to teach me about the klal. Again, we went over this, but a quick review to finish it up. And that is, the Torah says generally if you eat kadshim, you eat holy things, and you're tameh, you're chayav kares. Right? Chayav kares. It then says, if I eat a korban shlamim and I'm tameh, I'm chayav kares. That's totally redundant. Shlamim is something holy. So here we say, but shlamim teaches me that just like shlamim is something you bring on the mizbeach, and that's why you're chayav, so too, the only holy things for which you're chayav kares is kadshe mizbeach and not kadshe bedek habayis. Shlamim is teaching me about the klal. Now, this, I hope you notice, is a little different than the other 2 examples. Here, it's a pure repetition. It's not adding anything new in itself. But it's not teaching me anything about shlamim that I wouldn't have known. Had the Torah not mentioned shlamim, I would have known shlamim, you're chayav kares. There is nothing that it's teaching me about shlamim. The only thing it's teaching me is about the klal, that the klal is limited to kadshe mizbeach and not kadshe bedek habayis. The point I'm making is, sometimes what it's teaching you is both about itself and about the klal. Those were 2 of the examples. And sometimes it's only teaching you about the klal, and it's not teaching you about the prat at all, because there is nothing in shlamim that I'm learning that I wouldn't have known had it not said that. I would have known you're chayav kares reading shlamim, because it's kachim. Okay? Alrighty, so that's 8, 9, 10, 11. I think, it's good. Not too many people know this. So I don't know if you can just bring it up at a Friday night meal. It's not necessarily light conversation, but this is an important yediyah that, as I say, is not taught that much. It's not explored that much. So Baruch Hashem, if you're able to have a little bit of an understanding, it's a very good thing. Okay, so I think tomorrow we'll just finish it up. Of course, just to warn you down the pike that maybe after Pesach we'll do the 32 Middos of Rabbi Eliezer of Rav Yossi, and I got it. But okay, we'll see. Okay, thank you.